So trying to digest all this and trying to kind of get a handle on it, I believe that perhaps another way of looking at our nation, looking at the polarization of our country over these so-called wedge issues, be they same-sex marriage or abortion, that the reason we have this polarization stems from varying degrees of emotions of disgust. We can look back in time to when miscegenation, marriage between different races, was so repugnant for most of the population that laws were made to uphold human moral decency, thus preventing intermarriage. The rational argument that followed insisted that God did not want this to happen, which was simply a way of justifying one's initial personal disgust. Over time, views were not changed as much as younger generations were not as repelled by interracial marriage because seeing couples of different races became increasingly more common. It was about 2 years ago, after I had roughly a 20-minute interview with a reporter from the Salt Lake Tribune on same-sex marriage and Proposition 8 and all that kind of stuff, the only quote that they used in the paper was, Reverend Goldsmith says, old bigots must first die before marriage equality becomes real. I wish they had put that into context, because I got a lot of comments the next day. But you know, I still believe that the bottom line is true. All the arguments against marriage equality were actually made up following the initial gut reaction of what they felt was disgust. It is only a matter of time before a new generation does not feel the same emotion. As same-sex couples become more and more visible in society and are regarded more matter of fact, the younger generation has no negative gut feelings because they're growing up in a society where this is just a part of life. In polls across Utah, we learned that young Mormons have fewer issues with same-sex marriage than their elders, but probably not because they're able to reason better or reason more effectively, but because emotionally it is far less disturbing to them than it might be for their parents. And this is why it's so hard to argue with people who hold opposing moral views. Theoretically, yeah, we could win a rational argument, but apparently it is less about persuading the other rationally and more about being unable to penetrate their intractable emotion of disgust. Disgust is virtually impossible to eradicate. It is not something that we can argue anybody out of. I can personally account for this to be true. I've been kind of put in a bind myself. Since Unitarian Universalists hold strong to the principle of respecting the inherent worth and dignity of all people, I am frequently asked if I would let a white supremacist or neo-Nazi guy join the membership of this church. My emotion of disgust, or perhaps better phrase, my rage, my outrage, is immediately triggered and I scream, no. Then I formulate what I believe to be a rational argument. Being tolerant of intolerant people is not a moral virtue, I claim. A congregation that seeks justice for all people could not follow its mission effectively if others tried to steer us away from that. I become, like all people who follow their gut reaction with a reasoned response, I become my own public relations person, trying to sell my gut reaction as being sound and true. It becomes increasingly clear that morality is not something imposed on us by either theology or philosophy. It is something that is in us, though not necessarily in our guts, but in our DNA. The time has come, wrote the distinguished biologist Edward O. Wilson, the time has come for ethics to be removed from the hands of philosophers and become biologized. There is no such word as biologized, but if Edward O. Wilson wants to use it, I'm fine with it. The new view of morality is that it is at least partly shaped by evolution. Reason is not the basis of morality. We would like to think it is, that we are a step above animals so we can actually sit down and reason through a good, solid moral response. But through sociobiology, anthropology, evolutionary psychology, we come to understand that long before there were humans, long before there was language, animals banded together as a defense against predators. And for this purpose, they needed to moderate their behavior towards one another. All animals that either defend themselves or attack their enemies in concert must be, to some degree, faithful to one another. It's their gut instinct. I mean, animals of millions of years ago didn't have the luxury to contemplate Aristotle or Immanuel Kant or God to figure out what was right or wrong. They acted intuitively for their own survival, which results in a system of shared values where self-interests are sacrificed for the interests of the community. If you don't play by these rules, your prospect of surviving alone in the wilderness is not very promising. We now can identify the existence of special neural circuitry in the brain that is dedicated to both moral intuitions and also moral reasoning. So we don't have to throw out the Potter box altogether. Moral reasoning, we understand, is still prone to snap decisions made like our ancestors did many, many millions of years ago. So here's what's disturbing to me. In studying primate behavior, we have learned that our ancestors, these old primates, they actually understood the art of reconciliation. They understood peacemaking. They felt empathy. They would actually console the loser of a fight. They understood the intricacies of reciprocity. In other words, they held all the tools of morality. And we, with our larger brain, still somehow fall short. Children prove to us that we are hardwired for moral decisions. They may not have reflected on Kant's moral imperatives, but by age 3, they apply the concepts of good and bad to things and actions, including their own behavior. Between the ages of 3 and 6, they show feelings of guilt at having violated a standard. Moral intuition is part of our DNA, which is why in our reading this morning, 5-year-old Annie fell apart and felt the cruelty of the system as only a few families had a rich and satisfying meal, while she, along with just about every other family, was doled out some rice and water. And I think most of us would affirm her gut response to the situation and say, yeah, what a horrendous, lopsided reality in which we live. And that what she considered morally wrong, she may not use that term, what she considered morally wrong, we would agree with that, along with, I think, Aristotle and Kant and God. We all agree with Annie. So why? Why do we suffer such inequities in society today? Basically, we're still dealing with the same issues as did our evolutionary ancestors. Self-interest in conflict with the greater good. The chimps got it right. we're still struggling. So I figure if Professor Phelps from NYU got it right, that after watching a comedy, we're inclined to be more generous in our moral decisions, perhaps President Obama needs to appoint a super committee to determine which comedy Congress should view before deciding the fate of so-called entitlement programs. Perhaps an old Peter Sellers movie or Marx Brothers will save us from ourselves. I can only hope that Congress will advance to the moral stage of a 5-year-old child whose instincts about fairness, basic fairness, are so on target. So where does our sense of right and wrong come from? Well, it's been part of the evolutionary process for a long time. It's been a means to survival. But what about now? Will we continue to ignore the evolutionary imprints in our DNA? Will we manage to survive if we do?